ARMS had a pretty nice time in the spotlight for the first few days after its release, but the noise surrounding the game disappeared pretty quickly after. This isn't a terrible thing, as that's sort of the nature of games in general. However, one aspect that made it a real shame was that because ARMS was so different and strange on the surface, a lot of people didn't get the chance to see how a game like that would evolve in the competitive capacity. Of course, it's pretty easy to make sense of what's happening on screen for the most part. When you're watching two players in a match, you'll see them punching with their left and right arms, and, they'll throw some grabs in there sometimes, they'll be jumping and dashing, sometimes they'll block, and then every once in a while, one of them will do a super attack type thing where they either mash buttons or just flail depending on if they're using a gamepad or motion controls. So yeah, it's not hard to understand the game itself, but what does it look like when there's two players competitively invested in the game going at it? What are the pros and cons to each of these mechanics? And how do they all interact with one another? How does it culminate into the decision making of the two players in a match? What's stopping someone from just camping the other player out and waiting till they do something dumb to capitalize off of, and then playing lame until timeout? Well, I plan to answer as many of those questions as I can here. I've been involved as a competitive ARMS player for quite a long while after the game's release. I've even been involved in some other aspects within the scene besides competing, so I feel pretty confident in making sure you get a great idea of what the flow of a match usually looks like. Now, I won't go over absolutely everything, but I will cover a few vital aspects of all the basic universal options accessed from the controls of the game, like your movement options, your attacks, things of that nature. So, let's take a look, starting with the namesake of the game. ARMS! You've got two of them. Well, except for this character, but it might be best not to talk about it right now. Anyhow, you've got your left and right punches. These serve as both your offensive as well as defensive tools. The arms you choose are typically broken down into 3 weight classes, with the heavier and slower ones prioritizing defensive play and the faster and lighter ones focusing on offense. The middleweight arms usually serve as an in-between. Depending on the weight class, they can clash with your opponent's punches or even plow right through them, although the light arms are valuable in their own right due to their speed. Some arms are safe on shield and some definitely aren't, but that's not always tied directly to the arm's weight class. A lot of them will even have a specific element tied to them which can be activated through the use of charge. But honestly, there's so much to cover with elements that it deserves its own video. You've also got some niche archetypes that stand out from the usual tools, like the shield arms and, this thing. Whatever it does. The punches are divided into 2 phases, the extension and the retraction. The first couple frames of the arm's extension animation have no hitbox, however it does become active throughout the rest of the extension. You can dash right before you punch with only one arm to retain your dash momentum as the arm is extended. This is a vital aspect of the neutral in this game. The instant the retraction phase starts, you get free access to your movement options. Of course, this doesn't apply if your other arm is still extending. This allows for some pretty tricky evasion on top of your offense. One very important aspect about your punches is that it is the most efficient way to build your wonderfully shaped meter next to your health. We'll go over what that does later. Meter can be gained by throwing out your arms regardless of whether they hit, however you'll gain quite a bit more upon successful hits. This creates an interesting environment for the game where you're balancing different goals in the match, making sure you don't lean too hard on any specific one. For example, if you're going ham, throwing arms and building meter as you're attacking, you might get bopped pretty hard. If you're playing very passively, not committing too much and waiting for your opponent to attack before you try to deal damage yourself, you're potentially losing out on the resource war. Deflecting a punch with your own right before it hits will make your arm recover much faster than your opponent's, letting you act sooner. However, you're also potentially letting them build that much more meter from how long the arm has been out than if you deflected further away. And yes, I know I'm being vague about this pizza-shaped meter over here, but I promise you'll see how important it is once we get there. Alright, enough about the punches. Let's go over some other things you can do with your arms. This is a fighting game, so naturally grabs are going to be an important part of your offense. They build more meter than a single punch, but less than throwing out 2 punches together. The grabs in this game will have this sort of green tether in between the arms. The opposing player has a great counter opportunity when this happens by punching right through the tether and landing a hit before the grab recovers. They also have more restrictive aiming than punches, so it's not that hard for the opponent to evade them either. You might be thinking grabs seem really risky in this game, and you'd be right. There are a couple of upsides to them though. They're actually quite good for capitalizing on the opponent overcommitting to an option, and you can even create some pretty sneaky ways to incorporate a grab in a situation where the opponent can't punish you for it. whether due to a height advantage or some kind of quirk in the stage you're on. You can also grab while the opponent's in hit stun, which leads to a pretty big return damage-wise. The post-grab situation is pretty great for the player who lands the grab, as it often gives them an added benefit to their pressure afterwards, with some characters emphasizing this more than others. And yeah, she's annoying in this game too. This one's a bit of a stretch, but you legitimately do need both of your arms available if you want to block. You can't block if any of your arms are extended or if you're in the air. Naturally, your shield will fend off any punches directed towards you, however grabs will be a direct counter. Shielding is also another method for building the aforementioned pizza meter, but the meter gain for blocking punches is pretty pitiful. You get a decent amount of it though from blocking your opponent's pizza meter attack. The downside to this, however, is that this is one of the more common ways in which your shield can be damaged, leaving you incredibly vulnerable. Holding up your shield long enough will charge your arms, which, as mentioned before, allows you to use your arm's latent abilities. One other universal mechanic tied to shield that every character has access to is a dash cancel out of block stun. You can dash at any moment you're blocking an attack, but you'll only be able to dash directly forwards or backwards. One other neat thing about this is that you can also jump during this dash cancel, which is something some characters can most definitely take advantage of. Speaking of which, let's take a closer look at how the mobility options work. We're starting off slow first, literally so. Walking is the primary way of positioning yourself without making any hard commitments like dashing or jumping. You won't be locked out of any of those options while walking, so it's a great option for playing super reactively. It's also the only way you can taunt your opponents in this game created by Mr. John Nintendo. Not much else to say about it, honestly. I give it a 10 out of 10. Let's pick up the pace a little bit. Your dashes, of course, are going to be great for covering large distances and swiftly evading any attacks. I mentioned before about how retaining your dash momentum as you're punching is a vital part of neutral, but by itself, it's also the second most efficient way to build your meter. The dash typically has 3 different phases to it depending on how long you dash for. The first phase is from simply tapping whatever input you have tied to dash. You won't be able to shield during this, and just tapping dash will give you this little baby step. The second phase comes from holding down dash at least until you start to see your arms glow. It'll let you cover decent ground and give you charged arms for a decent amount of time, depending on the character. This specific phase of the dash can also activate an innate ability for some characters. The third phase starts when you hold down the dash button long enough to finish moving and your character starts to imitate whatever your favorite anime character may be. Holding it down to completion will give you the longest lasting retention for charge allowed for your character, otherwise referred to as full charge. Certain characters have at least one very important ability tied to this phase. So it's pretty clear how important dashing is, but what are the downsides to just spamming it outright? For starters, the 2 phases have a little bit of recovery where you're vulnerable. Doesn't last for too long, but a good read on your movement will definitely snipe it. The third phase doesn't have much noticeable recovery, but you are standing still during it, so, you know. And that's assuming no one won't snipe you before you get to it. One other huge weakness is something you may have already noticed. The character dashing will have one of their arms trailing off before catching up to them. It's quite scary when the opponent takes advantage of this because they can attack the arm that's trailing off and deal damage to it specifically, even if they aren't able to hit you directly. This is dangerous for a couple of reasons. One is that it will directly impact your shield health and how many attacks you can block. The other is that your arm can get damaged enough from being grazed that you'll be almost as compromised as when your shield breaks. Only you might still have your other arm to defend with as well as access to, let's say, a poor state of movement. Your arms can get grazed like this even when you're doing literally anything else or nothing at all. However, dashing allows the opponent a lot more slack and precision if they're aiming to compromise you in this way. Next up, we've got jumps. Dashing, but upwards. There's a lot of benefit to having the height advantage in this game. At a certain height, it's possible to punch the opposing player while also having your arms go over theirs. And the in-game camera in general doesn't track movement in that pesky y-axis very well. Jumping can be pretty strong for those reasons. The problem, of course, is that you'll eventually have to land and your landing lasts very long. You can't do anything during your landing either, so anyone taking flight mindlessly might leave them primed for the picking. One saving grace to make air movement trickier to punish though is the air dash. Most characters' air dashes are pretty nice for covering distance similar to their grounded dash. The problem, of course, is that you'll eventually have to land, but this time with all of your air options expended, which honestly feels even worse than getting hit from landing normally. Nevertheless, it's still a valuable option to opt for in the heat of the moment. It's not uncommon for players to jump out after their wake up and air dash out of the corner, because the camera has a harder time tracking player movement when someone's applying close range pressure. Then again, there's also been plenty of times when the person applying pressure sniffs out where the opponent's air dashing and then, well, it's simply just pain. It's a very high risk, high reward option. One other thing to note is that you can also go into full charge state by holding down jump. I'll be real though, no one does this, for reasons we've kind of gone over. It's much more common to see people go into full charge from an air dash in those situations, particularly in moments where certain characters' grabs leave them airborne. Finally, it's time to go over this triangle meter I've alluded to earlier, otherwise referred to as rush.
Press Z to unleash a rush. Help! Help! Flubber! No!
Look at him go. Now, I've mentioned a couple times about how important building meter, or rush, is, so we'll just get into what your rush actually does for you. First is the more obvious effect, where it converts into a huge chain attack dealing a lot of damage, which is pretty nice in its own right. You're able to confirm this opportunity by various means, whether with an arm having certain properties that lead into it, or by utilizing the environment around you to your advantage, leading to situations such as this infamous clip.
A free opportunity for Mimic to get the rush, but there's the grab, and that's a free charge for the dragon. And oh my goodness! We talked about the jungle on the trampoline. Unbelievable. Painting an orchestra in the corner with Mr. Master Mummy.
The second aspect of rush is almost if not more deadly than a chain attack. The yellow ring that appears during the activation of rush itself will deflect any punch or grab around you. The recovery for arms caught in this lasts longer than the recovery from hitting a shield, with the added benefit of it outright countering grabs as well. This deflect property provides an even larger opportunity to do some serious damage to someone who's overcommitted in the moment. However, you're not always guaranteed to land a rush, even if an arm gets deflected in the process. The player triggering it is not invincible during the entire phase of rush. It's only the actual trigger of the rush where the yellow ring around them is shown. There's also situations where the player with rush is too far away from the opponent to capitalize, or their camera is not well centered enough for them to find their mark. Rush can be shielded, but it does deal a decent chunk of chip damage, with a few arm combinations being able to break through even a full health shield, and also provide some handy space control due to the pushback on block. The final effect of rush isn't as direct as the other two, but still quite valuable in its own right. This effect allows you a little more leeway to overcommit than otherwise. In the event you're left exposed, where you have one or both arms out and the opponent's ready to counter, activating rush will retract your arms instantly. Only downside is that in that scenario you usually won't be able to use your high damage chain attack immediately after. You will, however, still be able to do most other things possible without rush. You can't grab while in this mode, but you can still walk, dash, jump, and block. Even if you can't cash out with a full damage rush because you have to protect yourself, you can still find better positioning due to holding onto that meter while also maybe, just maybe, still dealing some decent damage with the chain attack anyway. All three of these aspects come together to form a metered option that provides deadly offense, sturdy defense, as well as some crafty evasion depending on exactly how it's used. So with that, I hope you got a good understanding of how this game is played in a competitive environment, at least in the broad big picture perspective kind of way. There's still some things I didn't quite go over that would have been relevant. I kind of glossed over charge itself, for example, and the different armed elements triggered through charge. I also didn't cover the entire variety of arm types in this game, such as curves, multi-projectiles, homing missiles, that thing again, bounce arms, manders, and so on. There's also a lot of extraneous things I could have brought up, like the different ways you can stabilize the in-game camera, options to add iframes to your wake up, and the different ways in which height advantage makes confirms in the grab or rush easier or harder. But I wanted to give kind of a consolidated idea of how the game is played, so there you go. ARMS is a cult classic, so naturally it's not going to appeal to absolutely everyone. What I know though is that I've witnessed quite a few people see the game in a different light once they discover the competitive side of it, myself included. I'm definitely under no illusion that people watching this are just going to buy a 5-year-old game and try to interact with the cardboard boxes that make up the Switch Online infrastructure. But if you happen to be one of those people who didn't think anything special about this game and saw something that you thought was kinda sick, then hey, that alone makes me happy. So, whether you're someone who really enjoyed ARMS, someone who currently enjoys ARMS, or someone who just felt like learning about a random game and leaving it at that, thanks for watching this video and I hope you learned something cool from it.